We're here live in Brentwood, Tennessee. We've got first responders here. I'm glad they're here. We've got representatives from the Police Officer Credit Union Association, and we're going to talk about trauma. My name's Rob Michaels. I am the founder of Serve Protect, and in 2011, I decided, after much prayer, that it would be a good idea to form an organization that could help police, firefighters, dispatchers, corrections officers, people who are in forensic medicine, anybody in the public safety arena could find help with trauma. To determine how bad it is in our world, last year, 140 police officers and 129 firefighters committed suicide, more than the number that were killed in the line of duty by at least 20. In Chicago alone, police suicide is double the number of line of duty deaths. So what we're going to talk about today is what trauma is, how you can get help, how it impacts your family, how fitness plays into your ability to withstand trauma. We're going to do a financial support segment so you can understand how to plan for retirement. Now, some of you are chuckling right now. Retirement? Well, Nick's going to help you figure that out. Then we're going to talk about family, because the job impacts the family directly. How do we come up with strategies so that we don't have such an exorbitant divorce rate? And lastly, we're going to talk about faith. And I'm particularly excited that my old police partner is here. That's right, I'm old, but he's older than me. And it was Drew Grant that is as much responsible for this as I am. So let's get started. Make up your mind. No matter what comes your way, no matter how difficult, no matter how unfair, you will do more than simply survive. You can thrive in spite of it all. Beyond survive, strength to thrive. Now, I take particular pride in those pictures. The upper left is my daughter Holland. She was doing one of those mud races. That's my son on the right, and in the middle, he's a rock climber. I can't wrap my head around hanging upside down on a rock. But you notice at the bottom, right below him, are hands. You see, we're the hands. We're here to support you guys when you're hanging on that rock upside down. Plain talk about post-traumatic stress injury and suicide. Since 2011, we've helped more than 5,000 first responders who have called our crisis line. For 5 years, it was just me. And we were at about 3,000 then. So we've handled a lot of calls. Now it's not just me. And I'll talk more about who all is involved in our team. But God brought together a team that has been a great support and offers a lot of help for those that we serve. I'm the CEO and Serve Protect. I was an MP with the 229th Military Police Battalion. I was a patrol and detective with Norfolk Police Department. I'm a chaplain with the FBI here, state chaplain for the FOP. I do some lessons. I went to Columbia International University, got my degree from Wheaton, and I'm a member of the International Association of, I forgot what it is, but it's up there. It's a credential. And I was in the music business for 30 years. So you might look at that one picture on the first line up there with my hair down to here. Yeah, that was me back in the day. So I've been around the block. Contrary to myths, we're not superheroes. You know, people look at us, kids look at us like we have a cape. We don't. We're normal human beings that take on abnormal circumstances. We're willing to risk everything for people we don't even know. This is interesting. You know, people don't think much about the emotional side of what police officers and firefighters go through. Nicole Kidman is doing a new movie called Destroyer. And At the bottom it says they look at the emotional and physical trauma that she encountered, theoretically, in her role. And that's what they examine with this movie. Even Hollywood recognizes there are issues. Police face a severe shortage of recruits. In California, one city has such a shortage that they have the officers sleeping in RVs in the back because the RVs can't afford to live in San Jose. They drive out to where they can live, but they have to, during their shift, after shift, spend the night in an RV. This is the barn where we keep our feelings. If a feeling comes to you, bring it out here and lock it up. That's what we do, right? If you start feeling something, you just kind of want to ignore it. You don't want to admit it because we don't want to ever appear to be weak. If you don't acknowledge your emotions, you'll likely be acting them out. Emotional intelligence and proactive coping strategies lead to healthier and more satisfying lives. Our goal is to debunk the myths and stereotypes. You know, they refer to PTSD. We refer to PTSI. And we do that because we believe it's an emotional wound. It's not a mental disorder. Now, there is a physical injury that happens, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But it's the dirty little secret. Nobody wants to talk about it. In this particular incident, there was an officer that was struggling, and it came out what he was struggling with. It was an incident. Silence can be deadly. 46 officers were fatally shot last year. More than triple that committed suicide. Now, it drives me crazy when the news says, because I just heard it, 43 officers have been killed this year. No, 43 have been shot and killed. We're over 118 killed. They just never get it right. And they never talk about the police suicides. Now, this is data from IAFF. They did a partnership with Channel 4 in New York. 7,000 firefighters surveyed nationally. That's a good sample. So that means these statistics are valid. Now, because police and fire are quite similar, I would say that these apply in many ways to police. 95% experience critical stress. 77% have unresolved emotional issues. 71% have trouble sleeping. 65% have unwanted memories. Stress leads to substance abuse. 19% had thoughts of suicide. 81% fear they will be seen as weak or unfit for duty. That's the biggest problem we face right there. They're afraid to admit a need. And when you don't say that you're struggling, it gets worse. 87% think stigma creates a barrier for seeking help. 78% said departments fail to educate them about mental health issues. That is why we are doing what we are doing today. Because this is free for anyone to use. They can download it. They can watch it on their computer. Officers can watch it. Firefighters can watch it in the privacy of their home, right from our website, and learn what it is and what it's not. Here's the scary thing. 63% said EAP, employee assistance, is not much use. Now, is that a valid statement? It is for those who feel that way. I'm not saying employee assistance doesn't do anything. What I am saying is there are some issues. City by city, employee assistance will vary in what they offer and what they actually do. Every 17 hours, a law enforcement officer commits suicide. Now, these are old statistics, but what I would say is I challenge the police and fire organizations that have the money and the resources to do current research. We need to know these things. I actually think the Department of Justice and all the other statistics they gather should gather these information, not by name, but just so we know what the truth is. Some say 3 to 5 times the number of line-of-duty deaths. In Chicago, when Loretta Lynch put out her report condemning the Chicago Police Department, one thing buried in there was it was twice as many suicides as line-of-duty deaths. That's tragic. Many police suicides are not reported. They often do not report retired officer suicides because you don't know. Retired officers and firefighters many times just go away and fade into the woodwork, and nobody knows what happens. 75% of officers have been divorced, 87% of firefighters. 40% of first responders have been involved in domestic violence. Now, 3 years ago, there was a new sheriff out in San Francisco, and he had been on duty for 2 weeks, and his wife claimed that he punched her and hit her and stuff like that. Police go out there, they arrest him for domestic violence, and his wife started saying, well, he wasn't really doing too much. I mean, he was shoving me around and stuff. Well, that's domestic violence. I mean, you're not supposed to put your hands on anyone in a violent manner. Here in Tennessee, if there's a report of domestic violence and there is anything that looks like it, they go to jail. Somebody's going to jail. 100% begins with emotional desensitization at first trauma. What I mean by that, think back to the very first critical incident you went on. For me, the most significant one I remember was a multi-fatality car accident where the car hit one of those big aluminum stanchions. I was partners with my field training officer, who is a former Marine. And, I mean, he looked the role, little teeny mustache, and he had the shades. And we pulled up, and he said, go check it out. And I went over there. There were 6 people in the car, a girl in the middle of the front. Her legs were crushed. The other 5 occupants were dead. They were all looking at the ceiling with their eyes open. And I'd never seen anything like that. Now, we finished when the paramedics came and picked everybody up and took them away. My partner and I went on patrol. As I said, he's a former Marine. And you can pray for him because he's in a hospital now with 3 different kinds of cancer. Dave Thacker, he's a good man. So we come back around, there's a blanket laying in the median. And this is where the desensitization comes in. Thacker said, I said, there's a blanket laying out there. And he said, go get it. Well, that's what rookies do. So I got out and I grabbed the blanket, and what do you think was underneath of it? A body. And so I said, Dave, they left a body. So back then, paramedic units were new. They hadn't had a bunch of them. And so he got on the radio and he said, Rescue 5, and they responded. He said, you left a blanket. Can you come back and pick it up? And they said, well, can't you just throw it in the trunk? What do you think he said? What do you want to do with the body? Rescue 1 came on the air and said, I'll be there in just a moment. So, you know, you have a twisted sense of humor. It's what we develop. Now, quick commercial here. We have a free mobile app you download from serveprotect.org, and it gives you a complete replica of our website. The cast iron shield. Now, this is why we can do what we do. This is why you can look at that dead body and not think it's somebody's 14-year-old son. Because if you do, you lose it. Unless you've got a 14-year-old son, you're going to lose it anyhow. But it's a God-given defense mechanism for what first responders experience on the job. Keeps our emotions in check on the street so that when we see something tragic, we don't visibly act like we are broken. Keeps our emotions in check, but unlike the uniform, you can't disengage the shield at home. So it impairs family relationships. Now, when you first started on the job, if you were married then, your significant other didn't recognize you a year later emotionally. Because when you started, you might have been working at Sears or Penny's or Kroger or Walmart, and you became a police officer or a firefighter. Once you get out there and start seeing these things, it changes you emotionally. You think about things differently. And when you come home from work and you've just picked up a dead baby or a dead child, you don't want to go home and fix the toilet. when you walk in the door and your wife says, "You need to get up here and fix this toilet. It has been running all day. It's driving me crazy." And the guy goes, "Forget about it. Not now. Just leave me alone." Well, she doesn't understand what's going on. There needs to be a sense of communication. Now, later we're going to talk about what that sense of communication might be. It affects the way you talk to your children. I was talking to my kids one time, and I was asking them who did what, and nobody wanted to fess up. And the detective in me popped out, and I got that look, and my daughter goes, "Dad, we're not perps." Okay, I got it. Each experience hardens the shield. Every time you experience a traumatic incident, you feel less and less. I was doing a health fair for Davidson County, and a young girl came up, and she was all smiley, and I said, "How long you been on the job?" She said, "A few months." I said, "Give it a year, and you're not going to be all smiley like that. Nobody's going to recognize you." And I saw her the next year, and she said, "You were right." It just changes who you are and how you respond to emotional incidents. Family and friends will notice a change. If you don't master it, you don't have to be that way. You can recognize what's going on. You can talk to somebody, get support, and you don't have to be that way. Emotional desensitization, in my opinion, is the first step towards post-traumatic stress. Because as your emotions are desensitized, you don't respond emotionally the way you should. Common reactions to trauma. It's a distortion of time, sensory distortions, perceptual or behavioral distortions, sense of helplessness, limited choices. You feel like you can't help yourself. Feelings and impact of fight or flight, and disturbance in memory. I'll get more on disturbance in memory in a little bit. Post-traumatic stress is a mental health condition, an invisible emotional wound that develops in some people who have experienced a terrifying event. Now, that next line is critical. It is a normal response to trauma. Before we get on the job, we're not wired to encounter those kinds of things, to see body parts and dead people, fatalities, all manner of evil. We're not wired for that. So, when you respond emotionally in private or however you do, it's a normal reaction. So we'll have people call and they'll say, I'm having flashbacks and nightmares. Does anybody else have that? Yeah, they do. It's a normal reaction. You're not sick. Nearly everyone will experience a range of reactions after trauma. Most people recover from initial symptoms naturally. Simply put, post-traumatic stress, it's emotional, meaning stress. Post means after, an experience. So it's all it is stress that you incur after trauma, either seeing it or hearing about it. You can actually hear about stuff, the death of a police officer, death of a firefighter. That directly impacts us. We feel it. In layman's terms, when someone is either engaged in or witnesses a traumatic event, the incident first processes the short-term memory, and in time processes the long-term memory. Sometimes it gets stuck in short-term memory, and that's where the trauma starts spinning around in your head. You start feeling the symptoms, and that's when you need to find somebody to talk with, because they'll help you work through that. Now, when I said loss of memory, there's an area in the brain called Broca's area. It helps put thoughts and feelings into words. Broca's area shuts down during trauma. So think about the impact of that. So you've just been in a critical incident, and the media shows up. What happened? You don't really know. You've got an idea of what happened, but if you think about it, 2 or 3 days later, you go, "Oh yeah, I remember this was part of that." Well, that's why it's important not to make a statement until 24, 48 hours. You have to have time to get your thoughts back together. Words will fail to capture the experience. Dr. Carrie Steiner is a clinical psychologist that was 13 years on the job with Chicago PD. She's now a clinical psychologist in the Wheaton area and treats a lot of folks from that region. Common reactions: hypervigilance, you be tense, you're on guard; anger or rage; sleep problems; anxiety; depression. And hypervigilance is that feeling when you're driving along and you see somebody behind you and you turn left and they turn left and you go, then you turn right just to see what they're going to do. Well, if they turn right, you start getting nervous. Well, that's hypervigilance. And in other areas, for some, it's hearing a loud noise. For me, our home was burglarized. Every time we leave to go, I'll turn the alarm on, I'll start to walk out, then I'll go back and make sure I lock the front door. It's because we had a break-in. That's part of my routine now, but it's all part of hypervigilance. Relationship issues. None of us have relationship issues. That's why the divorce rate's so high. But social withdrawal, potentially suicidal ideations. Sometimes we get angry with God. Addiction is not a symptom of post-traumatic stress, but it can be a byproduct through self-medication. You might think, you know what? If I had a drink or two, that would take the edge off. Well, after a while, that drink or two can become a six-pack or two, and you become addicted to keep yourself medicated. That's the wrong way to do it, because that creates a whole realm of other problems. My dad was an alcoholic. He died in DTs. He fell off a tugboat trying to chase little green men. It was because of the addiction that he had and what it did to his brain. Alcohol, some other medications. With alcohol in particular, it destroys your brain physically. It ruins your liver. It messes with your kidneys. And when he had his autopsy, it was clear he was a walking dead man anyhow. But that's what happens with addiction. According to the DSM-5, the highest rates of PTS, I forgot to get the D off of there, are found among survivors of rape, military combat, first responders, and those who have been in captivity. It expanded the criteria: re-experiencing and intrusive thoughts, avoidance, negative alteration in cognition and mood, or marked alteration. You become somebody different. You respond to things differently. Sometimes it's anger, sometimes it's rage. It's an emotional wound. Understanding the limitations of fight or flight response. This is brand new from American Military University. They have Rebuilding Officer Resiliency, a treatment guide, and they talk about the emotional wound that occurs. And up at the top, the neural pathways are altered. What that means is it actually, in a sense, rewires your brain when you have experienced trauma. That's why we think differently. Going through trauma helps put it back the way it should be and helps you understand things better. So in that regard, it is an emotional wound. And this is talking about post-traumatic stress injury versus PTSD. Labeling something as a disorder can suggest something negative about a person's character or something that can't be changed. Calling it an injury clarifies that the person has experienced something horrifying or traumatic. That's why we really focus on post-traumatic stress injury, not disorder, because there's a stigma attached to it. That's why people don't want to report it. If you pulled up on the scene of an accident and you look, and the car's smoldering under the hood, you're going to break that window to get the driver out that's unconscious. Well, what if when you reach in, you slice your arm? Well, it'll be bandaged on the scene. You'll go to the hospital. They'll give you a shot to make sure you didn't get anything. They'll stitch it up, and then there will be a protocol of follow-up. But what happens is if you look in the back seat and there's a dead baby, it's a whole different thing. It's an emotional wound. I did a debriefing for a department locally. There was an 18-wheeler on Interstate 65. It was icy. And there was a family that was driving down the road. They saw somebody disabled. The mother and son got out of their car. They were in a lane of traffic. An 18-wheeler saw them, locked up, went sideways and killed the mother and child, 12-year-old boy. One of the responding officers had a 12-year-old son. So those are the things where trauma comes from. But they need to be treated just as much as that physical wound. Because a person who has a traumatic experience, if they talk with somebody, and you see, not everybody responds the same way. They might have that response, whereas somebody else might not. The one with the 12-year-old son, it messed with him. The one that didn't, not so much, because there was no direct connection there. Invisible wounds can kill. If you don't ask for help, if you're the guy that stuck his arm through the window and cut his arm, you just pull your jacket over it and say, I can fix it when I get home. Well, what if it's infected? There's potential for gangrene. You could lose your arm. You could lose your life. With trauma, there's a protocol of follow-up. A trauma therapist will sit down with you and help you understand what you are feeling and why you're feeling it. And she'll help you be equipped with tools to work through that. Pre-trauma risk factors, family instability. Now, if you look that up in the dictionary, it's got a picture of my family there. Because I'm telling you, my stepmother's name was Butch, and that woman was unstable. She was from Picayune, Mississippi. We found out that my dad was her 7th husband when she went after number 8. Her mom said, well, did she hurt him? I said, well, he wasn't happy. No, I mean, did she hit him with a bottle? What? Well, one she threw hot grease on, another one she hit with a hot iron. I said, wait a minute. How many did she have? Well, she had 7. He was number 7. I said, good to talk to you. Goodbye. I thought pool was a contact sport until I was 15. But family history of psychological issues, multiple early losses, trouble with authority, genetics, absence of social support. We tend to isolate. Earlier depression or anxiety, early substance abuse, ineffective coping skills. Now, in addition to post-traumatic stress, there are other areas where we have issues. Compassion fatigue. When we become police or firefighters, paramedics, dispatchers, we want to help people. We want to make things right. And in law enforcement or corrections, there are times where you find this kid and you think, you know what? If I can get to him, I can turn his life around. Only to get a call that he's done something else. In corrections, they'll see him and they'll talk with him. But the recidivism rate brings them right on back because they don't listen. Compassion fatigue is a state experienced by those helping people or animals, and in some cases they may be the same thing, in distress. It is an extreme state of tension and preoccupation with the suffering of those being helped to the degree that it can create secondary traumatic experience for the helper. When you're talking to somebody and they've been through a trauma and you didn't witness it, you can be traumatized by what they're telling you they saw. If you've never experienced it, it can become a shock to your emotional system. Caring too much can hurt. You see, when we invest emotionally in someone we think we can help, sometimes when they don't do what we think should happen, it can hurt personally. So what we end up doing, we back out. We don't get that personal connection. Compassion fatigue is caused by empathy. It's a natural consequence of stress resulting from caring and helping traumatized or suffering people. Let's see, what professions would that describe? Anybody in public safety. Compassion fatigue was often triggered by situations in which you thought you could make a difference. Maybe there was a problem internally. You know, if you talk to those in corrections, they feel like they're given an unachievable goal with too few people to help them out. How often do you read about corrections officers being assaulted? 2 officers moving a dozen prisoners. Well, those prisoners aren't stupid. They can read the odds. And one of my friends that worked with the corrections department here in Tennessee was assaulted, he and his partner, by a gang of 12 guys. They were moving because they didn't have the resources to do it properly. Caregivers need to be able to deliver service and excellence without compromising their well-being. That's critical right there. And it affects you mentally, emotionally, the way you behave, spiritually, and somatically. That's how you respond physically. You know, if you're struggling with compassion fatigue or any of the emotional issues, it can make you tired. It can make you not able to sleep or to sleep too much. Authentic and sustainable self-care begins with you. Now that sounds crazy, doesn't it? Be kind to yourself. You think, why wouldn't I be kind to myself? Well, sometimes because you take on blame for something you can't control. You know, a good goal is only a good goal if you can control the outcome. If you set a goal for yourself in terms of fitness, well, if there's no way in the world you're going to be able to achieve that. I mean, I go to the gym 4 times a week, and I could say my goal is to be able to bench press 400 pounds. Ain't no chance in the world I'm going to be able to bench 400 pounds. Not at this age. But you see, you've got to set realistic goals. So you can't say to yourself, you shouldn't say to yourself, I'm going to change this person. Who in here can actually change somebody else's life? Nobody. Because the desire to change has to come from the person that you want to see change. You can inspire them, you can motivate them, you can encourage them, but you can't change them. This is why a lot of marriages fall apart. It's expecting something that can't happen. Listen to others who are suffering. Clarify your personal boundaries. That's important. You know, I know of a person in a department south of here that she needed an amplified headset. She was a dispatcher. And her supervisor went over, pulled off the cans and yelled in her ear, "Can you hear me now, dummy?" Well, that was violating her boundary. She now lives in Florida after winning the lawsuit. Again, this is selfless, shameful promotion for our mobile app. Vigilance and fatigue. Long-term vigilance fatigue is a concern for anyone who has to deal with serious threats over time. Now, here in Brentwood, Franklin, we're not as concerned about MS-13 or terrorists coming in as they would be in New York, Chicago, some of the larger urban areas. Now, we do have bad people that live here and do bad things. But you don't have to be on guard all the time fearing that the people that live over there in that section are going to do this. Now, there is reason to be vigilant every time you hit the street because you have to be aware of everything going on around you. That's being vigilant. Sometimes it can cause stress and it can create issues. Law enforcement is on the homeland front line in the war on terror. Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin said that. Now, this is the guy that John Wayne wanted to be. He was one of the founders of Delta Force. He was shot with anti-aircraft fire When he was in a helicopter, it caught him in the side, and he continued the battle. I mean, this is a tough guy. And he told me, you need to tell your guys that they're on the front line of terror. There are several reasons why vigilance can lag. Complacency. It can be brought on by familiarity with the threat. You know what? You become so used to that being a threat that you don't see it as a threat anymore. Particularly if something hasn't happened in a while. That's settled down until it hasn't. Vigilance fatigue in policing is a critical threat to public safety and officer well-being. Price of freedom is eternal vigilance and a willingness to act in its defense. What are we told all the time? Keep your eyes open. Look for anything unusual. And so those who are in law enforcement, who are in firefighting, when you're on a call, you're always scanning. I went over to Chief Goss's office the other day for the Brentwood fire. I looked and he had bulletproof vests in his office that he was going to distribute to his men. It's a sad day when firefighters have to wear a bulletproof vest. It's where our culture is gone, and it's why we are so vigilant. The truth about post-traumatic stress injury. Not all who experience the same event develop post-traumatic stress. Emotional trauma is a normal response to abnormal circumstances. The things we encounter in life or on the job. Critical incidents. We all know what they do. We've talked about that already. When you respond to an accident, to a shooting, to a suicide. Failure to communicate what you're feeling. That's the point of debriefings, but too often, those who are being debriefed don't actually say anything. They don't want to open up. They're afraid to show their vulnerability. The cumulative impact. You see, it's not like police and fire see a bad incident and then they're done. They've met their quota. No, it's a string of things. If you've got a long career, you've seen a lot of bad stuff. I talked to a state trooper a few years ago, and he needed help. He said, I've been doing this job 30 years. I've probably seen 150 or 200 dead people on the interstate. And it all adds up. And going to the right therapist is critical. When we get a call in for somebody that wants help, we find somebody that takes their insurance, that's near them, but the most critical component is we interview every therapist we refer to because we want to make sure they understand the job. Had a guy from Chicago call. He had been on the SWAT team, 30 years he'd served. He was going to retire and go to a smaller department. They wanted him to have a psych eval. Well, he goes in to speak to the psychiatrist. The guy wanted to hear war stories, kept talking. Tell me what you saw. Tell me what you did. Well, it reopened those emotional wounds. And when he drove off, he had to pull over. He was crying so hard from everything he had seen that he had put away, and this yahoo decided to ask him questions that shouldn't have been asked. And so we referred him to a different therapist that understands. He's doing fine, and he got the job he was going for. But making sure you can't just go into a phone book and pick somebody out that says they're a therapist, a counselor. We refer to people that do EMDR as one of the primary resources. It's a great eye movement desensitization reprocessing. We also refer to somatic experience, brain spotting, rapid resolution therapy. They all help those who have struggled with emotional stress. We've seen quite a good result from that. Administrative conflict or bullying, inadequate leadership, arbitrary or administrative decisions, and shifts, assignments, and discipline. Not that that ever happens. So some of the things that we hear about. A woman who claimed brutality over nothing is indicted on 5 charges. She claimed that she was brutalized by police, but then that darn body cam showed that she was lying. And here we've got the Blue Lives Matter on the left Don't ask me how she did it, but she sprayed defecation on the officer. Now, that'll bother you emotionally in many ways, but she was obviously arrested. Then all of these officers were killed. Oversight panel says cops broke policy by shooting at a man actively firing at them. The officer got in trouble because somebody shot at them and they shot back. Well, you can't do that. Trooper disciplined for chasing down a subject who intentionally rammed her. The entire police force was suspended after the chief was charged. See, with those kinds of things, it causes many officers to respond differently. They don't want to get in trouble, and it causes them to put themselves in danger when they shouldn't. Now, survivor guilt. To some degree, we all feel this when we hear of a firefighter or a police officer killed in the line of duty. You feel that, man, that could have been me. I've done that thing before. I mean, I could have been killed. You feel, particularly if you know the person that died. You were on a call together. It really wears on you. I just was down in a city south of here. Firefighter died. They were all in a building. It was burning. And he held up the falling timber so his buddy could get out, and it collapsed on him. His uncle was an FBI agent, Steve Dickey. That young man's a hero. But think about all of those that survived because he let them get out before he died. Why did I walk away? This officer was involved in an incident, and he walked away from where his partner was. His partner was shot and killed. And he's struggling with, why in the world did I stand there with him? Why did I leave him on his own? Realistically, if you're going to a house, one might take the front and one might take the back. But the problem is, if the man in front gets shot, it weighs on you heavily. If a firefighter goes into a building and the rest of the guys don't get in there right behind him and there's a backdraft or something happens, it makes you feel bad. My brother-in-law was a firefighter. What is survivor's guilt? It's a common experience among those who have survived life-threatening situations. Survivor guilt has been identified in veterans, those who survived the Holocaust, first responders, transplant recipients. Symptoms of survivor guilt typically include difficulty sleeping, traumatic, due to the traumatic event, loss of emotional stability, irritability, a sense of numbness. Although survivor guilt can have a lasting and significant impact on mental and emotional well-being, if unaddressed, it may also serve an adaptive function. Those who survive may transform their feelings of guilt into a sense of increased meaning and purpose. You start blaming yourself. Survivor guilt after large-scale tragedies. Guilt can develop following small-scale events, such as a car accident where some people died. Imagine being that driver that has an accident and the passenger dies. I know a guy who was in a car where the driver died, and he struggles every day. Why wasn't it me? He was a good guy. Why did he die? Why not me? What else can cause it? Financial strain or lack of skills. This afternoon, we're going to have a class on finances, budgeting, living within your means, debt reduction strategies, pitfalls that first responders fall into, how to maximize your employer benefits. You know, every Christmas, too often, police and fire have to wonder, You know, I want to give my kids the same thing that everybody else is getting. You know, but I need to take on a second, a third job to do that. Police and fire have multiple jobs. And I actually hired one to do some plumbing work for me. So the point being, with the pay as it is and the expectations of family members who see everybody else getting everything, going everywhere, well, why can't we do that? Well, that puts a strain on them. Family struggles. Spousal worrying when the first responder goes on shift. But too many times, departments don't train the families what to expect. So, wife sitting there watching the news, all of a sudden they see a house fire in their area where their husband works, or they hear of a shooting, an officer down, and their husband works that area. Those are terrible things to put on families. They don't understand the emotional change that's going to happen. And so it causes conflict, diminished romance, fear around police killing, ambushes, protest, media. Just think of all the media that was around when we had the Dallas shootings, the ambushes in Louisiana, and all of the other killings of police officers. Criminal justice professor wants future cops killed. Criminal justice professor. Now, he's every bit a goober. You can look at him and see that. Rioters continue to do, throwing chemicals on police, spitting on police. Gunman shot officer in the face 1 week after being released by a judge on a gun charge. Part of the problem is the judicial system, with judges who don't want to prosecute people who have done bad things. They let them out. How many times do you read where somebody was killed by a repeat offender who just got out on bond? Now California is saying, well, we think bond is unconstitutional. You shouldn't have bond. They should just be able to walk out until they're proven guilty. That's insane. Shootings of police officers reached the highest in decades. This guy here, he calls for the killing of cops and police, and he had ties to the Dallas shooting. And yet people say that's just free speech. You can ask people to kill police. Does it have an effect? You bet it does. Billionaire George Soros spent $33 million for Antifa and Black Lives Matter to go out and protest police. $33 million. Imagine what we could do with $33 million for equipment for police and firefighters to do the job better. Southwest City in fire, it came out that the city will not, well, first they were going to make them pay for their own insurance. Well, then there was such a public outcry, they decided we probably ought not do that. They were going to make the firefighters pay for their own bills, not back them. She said she was sexually assaulted by a state trooper except for his body cam. People make complaints, false complaints all the time. Waitress caught framing the sheriff's employees with bogus racist message on check. They were paying their bill. She made a racial statement on the check and said, look what that cop just did. They lied. Now, the entire police force here was suspended in North Carolina, and sometimes the wrong is inflicted by our own, and it makes us feel really bad. Police force suspended after the arrest of the chief and the lieutenant. Rogue Baltimore Police Unit ringleader. He was arrested for committing crimes. I know both of those guys. The one on the left, Reuben, he was a star law enforcement officer, went into the gang unit. All of a sudden, he became the ringleader with a cartel distributing drugs. He served 18 years in prison. During the time he was in prison, he turned his life around. And now he's telling others what not to do. Robert Davis was a police officer in New Orleans back when they were hiring convicted felons to be cops. And he was trying to resolve tickets a way you can't do with young women. And he had been trained that that was okay. His partner said, man, if you can get that, that's good. Well, he got convicted because the woman decided enough's enough. And so he went on the run for 22 years. He lived in the woods and finally turned himself in. PC politics, anti-police activists, political activists, and malicious prosecutors can cause post-traumatic stress-related symptoms. Think of Cambridge. That's where part of this began. Police officer doing his job, did nothing wrong, and on national news was accused of acting stupidly until everybody realized he was doing his job. He didn't do anything wrong. Ferguson, Baltimore, Dallas. The media assumes that they're guilty until proven innocent. Now, in Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby charged 6 police officers with murder. The judge who heard the cases exonerated all 6, and he's not one afraid to convict police officers. That wasn't enough. She decided she would arrest a police officer who was chasing a man with a gun. His nightstick that he was carrying when he was chasing him accidentally hit the man. She charged him with assault. And she lost that one in court too. But you see, malicious prosecution is something that we see happen and is inappropriate. How about this? During the Baltimore riots, the mayor tells the police, now what are we charged with doing? Police and fire. Protect the citizens, protect their property. And the mayor says, give them room to destroy. I don't get that. But that's what she said. She was on video saying that. And she said, I didn't say it. Well, then the videotape came out, so that was unfortunate for her. But the point being, when politics get into law enforcement, it always goes haywire because somebody's got an agenda, and that causes emotional stress with our guys. For example, in Ferguson, how many celebrities, athletes, entertainers, media did you see doing the hands up, don't shoot? The problem is witnesses at the scene said, never happened. Did not happen. We saw what happened. The guy that alleged the hands up, don't shoot, later recanted when he was put under oath. He realized he couldn't lie about that. But yet, that persists. And what that does is it shapes public perception of law enforcement in a negative way. That's something we shouldn't be doing. Now, let me just say this. If a police officer does something wrong, don't hear me say we should look the other way. A police officer in Chicago, they got convicted, should never have gotten out that car and shot that boy 16 times. Police officer in South Carolina, shooting a fleeing felon in the back. Can't do that. And those who serve don't want those who serve and do bad things to be on the job because it makes us all look bad. Now, the result of these kinds of media attacks, Chicago police officer and one in Louisiana or Florida, both of them were afraid to respond when being assaulted, so the assailant took their guns from them and beat them in the head. And they both said one common thing: I didn't want to show up on the media and embarrass my department. They were afraid to protect themselves. That is trauma. Now, we helped both of these guys. On the right, this guy had a reality TV show. He was in North Carolina. The other was in South Carolina. The one on the left was the chief of the department. He was involved in a shooting. He was cleared by local, state, and federal authorities. It was a justified shooting. Nothing wrong happened. 3 years later, after Ferguson, when Darren Wilson was exonerated, a new prosecutor charged that man with murder. Now just think about that. He had already been cleared in the investigation. He had never been charged. At the end of the day, the man on the left, they broke it down to a misdemeanor. Now, how much of a murder charge was that if they break it down to a misdemeanor? It wasn't. On the right, he was in North Carolina. He shot a guy. Just happens to be that he shot him on the road that was named after the guy's family that he shot. Year and a half after Charlotte, a new prosecutor charged him with murder. He didn't even know he had been charged. He had moved to Tennessee from North Carolina, got a call from his buddy and said, "Man, did you know you're charged with murder?" He said, "What?" He had to go back home for the amount of time that the trial lasted, and he was absolutely cleared. You see, when political entities want police officers charged to prove a point, that's wrong. Now, if the officer does something, he needs to be charged. It needs to be proven in a court of law, not proven in public opinion. And too often that's what happens. Now, Loretta Lynch wrote a terrible indictment on Chicago police, the one where it mentioned twice as many suicides. Jeff Sessions was just there. He studied what she wanted done. He said the problem's not the cops. The problem is the criminals. You see, are there cops that do bad things? Yes, there are. I showed you some. But that's not the preponderance of officers. 99% of those who serve on the street are good guys. We talk to them every day. We help them every day. Same thing with firefighters. But yet, if you listen to the media, police are bad. You can't trust them. Now, think about pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon. Well, after that happened, 3 officers were killed. And they had a strong uptick in assassinations of police officers. What do we want, dead cops? There's a direct correlation, because a young man that was in that march heard them say, "What do we want? Dead cops." Went home to Baltimore, picked up his firearm, shot his girlfriend, went back to New York. Those 2 officers were sitting in their patrol car, and he shot them in the head, and then killed himself. Words have impact. They have consequences. And the point that I'm making with all of this that we're talking about creates a stressful situation for those in law enforcement. There was an officer north who pulled up on the scene at a playground. A man had a firearm. He pointed the firearm at the officer. The officer, because of all that's gone on, was afraid to shoot the man that was pointing a gun at him, so he tased him. What do you think happened? He shot the officer. You see, we've got to get to a time when right is right, wrong is wrong, and we don't try to cloud the situation. We stop pointing fingers. We start working together to make our communities better. Police deserve to be, well, an anarchist calls for the death of Trump supporters and cops. Antifa professor calls for the killing of police officers. You see, when these things come out, kill the cops, and in this one in particular, police officer shot this man, and protesters saying he was unarmed. Well, you see right there in the man's gun belt, a gun. I mean, if an officer does something wrong, let's hold them accountable. But if they don't, let's stop this goofiness. because it does cause emotional stress. Now, it didn't just happen now. This woman was part of the Black Liberation Army, and they're looking for her. She's living in Cuba. This was back with the Weather Underground. They wanted to blow up the police station, and they did blow up something near it. Bill Ayers, who is now a college professor, oddly enough. National activist organizations demanding civilian oversight. Now, that's something that's current right here in Nashville. They're wanting to pass a situation where they have a citizen overview of police actions. Now, they're not law enforcement. They're not lawyers. And in fact, the one in Chicago has activists on it. It was formed by an activist organization. They actually reviewed an officer-involved shooting that happened 2 years before where the officer was cleared, and they brought it back up again to try and get the officer. You see, oversight's not the issue. It's bringing activists on who are anti-police to make judgment over police. That doesn't make sense. I mean, that's like hiring a bank robber to be on the bank review board and asking him to make sure all of your procedures and policies are in order. It's a sad state. Florida Fire Commissioner, firefighters should carry guns. Body armor made mandatory for South Carolina firefighters. Who is at risk for emotional stress with all that we've talked about? All first responders, dispatchers, corrections officers experience traumatic events. Often, they're a byproduct of the job. Trauma can also be caused by job stress. It's my contention that all first responders are affected by trauma in some form. It may be hardened emotions, the cast iron shield. But it's like the old adage, you can't walk through the same stream twice because you disrupted some of the rocks, so it's not the same stream. Once you've had an emotional experience on the job, you can't undo that. You don't get a mulligan and say, I want to forget that one. I can still to this day remember the last accident that I pulled up on. I was a detective. I was on 26th Street, and right at Colley Avenue, I looked up, and there was a car spinning on its roof. I looked to the right, and there was a Volkswagen crushed against the telephone pole. I ran over, I called it in, looked inside the Volkswagen, and I heard an 18-year-old college freshman breathe her last breath. As I'm telling you this, I can hear it. You know, that's a traumatic experience. Equally bad, the drunk driver got out laughing and said, man, I guess I effed up. Let's just say I wanted to take him in a body bag. Couldn't do it, but I knew what was going to happen. And what happened that I thought came up. We had the trial. The man was found guilty. They took his driver's license during the week. No, excuse me. They gave him his driver's license so he could drive to work during the week. And he'd serve time in jail on the weekends. Well, her parents said, how is this fair? I said, it's not. But I have no control over the outcome. All police can do is make the arrest and present the evidence. Court has to hear the case, and the jurors or the judge makes that decision. Too often we have judges that don't go by the law. They go by their heart, or they go by their political beliefs, and they let the person go. This can't happen. That young girl is dead, and that man's living his life, having a blast. We had a police officer in Norfolk get shot. He was one of my training officers, a guy named John Stein. Went to a domestic violence call. It was a Navy cook. He shot his wife and shot through the front door and hit my partner. I was on vacation. That man, for shooting a police officer and shooting his wife, got 180 days in jail. You see, this is the world that law enforcement lives in. And when a family member asks, why did they get off with that? We have no control over that. Absolutely none. So emotionally, think how that makes an officer feel who prosecutes a case for a judge to let it go with some minimal sentence, just like 180 days for shooting a woman and a police officer. Doesn't make sense. For public safety, critical incidents are cumulative, like I said. It's not a single incident. When you experience trauma, your left brain functions defer to your right brain. Now, where was Broca's area? Left brain. That's what helps you articulate what you just saw. So you're in a critical incident, and you're trying to express what happened at the end of the incident. Well, you're still experiencing trauma until those sides of the brain, so to speak, rejoin. You're not going to remember everything that you saw. The left side is executive functioning, linguistic, sequential, analytic. The right side is intuitive. That is where your fight or flight, your survival mode is. So when you're in trauma, you're acting in survival mode. Whether you're a police officer or a citizen that's being attacked, you're in survival mode. Now, Broca's area, like I said, is it puts what you experienced into words. That's why, once again, there needs to be a cooling off period, if you will, before that officer or firefighter is expected to make a statement that is cohesive, because they just simply don't remember everything. Carrie Steiner suggests they wait 2 sleep cycles before making a statement if involved in a critical incident. And that includes the media. The media has this demand to know right now. If it's an ongoing investigation, the media has no right to know until a decision is reached. Now, why is that? Well, if they interview witnesses that just saw something, the same thing applies to them. They might not be thinking clearly. Eyewitnesses are not necessarily always reliable. And when they go by that and they make assumptions, when the case comes to a different conclusion, people have already bought into the lie, not into what actually happened. That puts a lot of stress on the departments, on the city, and on the officer involved in the incident. It's not fair to them. If they did something wrong, it'll come out. But if they didn't, why make them a villain if they didn't do anything wrong? In a traumatic experience, reaction may be automatic and not recalled clearly because it was not key to survival. Memory distortion, time and tunnel vision, perceptions, best to wait 2 sleep cycles. Carrie told me about a police officer in Chicago that was involved in a shooting. They asked him how many rounds did he fire. He said 1. So they took him in to question him. They showed him his magazine. He had fired 7 rounds. Was he lying? No. When you're in survival mode, your job is not to count the number of rounds you're shooting. It's to stop the threat, to neutralize the threat. That's what this officer did. But they tried to make it that he was lying, and he wasn't. He just simply didn't remember. Remember, if you're not treated after a critical incident, the brain can stay in survival mode. Emotional impulses continue to trigger, and this can easily become post-traumatic stress. Now, it's normal, and with proper treatment, it can often be relieved, changed, and healed. Trauma combined with self-medication is a deadly cocktail. That's why I was saying earlier, addiction, self-medication is not part of the trauma, but it's a byproduct. And when they start self-medicating, those with post-traumatic stress are 2 to 4 times more likely to use drugs or alcohol. It's a terrible thing, and it can lead to further depression. Hopelessness can be deadly. You see, when people go through a traumatic experience, when they're struggling with post-traumatic stress, and they haven't been able to be helped, they may have gone to a therapist. That therapist may not have understood trauma. And they tried to talk, they may not have understood the job. That's a big deal. So when they come to us, they might say, well, I've been to a counselor. Did they do EMDR or any of the other procedures? No. Did they understand anything about your job? No. Let us help you. But by that time, this person had gotten even more hopeless because they felt like there was nobody that could help them. When they get to somebody that can help them, their lives are born new. They feel like they have new life, new hope. And without hope, when somebody doesn't have hope, they're ready to commit suicide because they feel like they have no need to live. Now, there's a physical impact of trauma. After a general suicide, the Army's looking at officer health. Why does post-traumatic stress increase the risk of cardiovascular disease? A growing number of patient studies show that people who suffered trauma are at a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And that's from the VA, Science Daily. The VA shows the same correlation that stress can, in fact, impact your heart. Consider the following statistics. Law enforcement officers have a higher rate of obesity. Well, think about it. When I was on with Norfolk, when I was on nights, after midnight, the only place open was Mickey D's and Pizza Hut. So after you eat enough Big Macs and pepperoni pizzas, you put on a pound or two. I was 165 pounds when I joined the police department. I've been through basic training and was an MP. And the chief, a guy named Bubba Staler, was an old baseball player. He looked and he goes, how much you weigh, son? I said, 165. He said, you're going to gain 50 pounds your first year. I said, get out of here. He was right. I did. I actually got up to 250 pounds. That's right. I was heavy D. I mean, I wore 50 sports coats and 46 size waist pants. I got smart and lost weight. Now, an estimated 40% of peace officers in the United States have a sleep disorder. Well, we worked on rotating shifts, 7 to 3, 3 to 11, 11 to 7. Try living with that changing, and we changed every 7 days. So by the time you got used to sleeping after a night shift, then you went on days. Then you're up bright and early, and you have to be awake the whole day. Then you work evenings. When we were detectives, we worked 8 to 4 and 8 to 4. Well, when you work at night 8 to 4, and the way our system worked, if you arrest somebody, you go to their arraignment the next morning. Well, try getting off at 4 o'clock and thinking, I'll catch a couple of winks, and then I'll go to court at 8 o'clock. Well, that don't work so well. You're really tired. And being tired on the job is not safe. The suicide rate for peace officers is higher than the rate for the general population. An estimated 40% of peace officers in the United States have the sleep disorder. The divorce rate is high. The average lifespan of an officer after retirement, 2 to 5 years. That's terrible. Lack of emotional and physical fitness can directly impact cognition and reaction time. During a traumatic event, the nervous system goes into survival mode and sometimes has difficulty reverting back to its normal, relaxed mode. Experts have noticed that experiencing a traumatic event can have an impact on the development of pain. In fact, approximately 15 to 30% of patients with chronic pain also have post-traumatic stress. So there's a physical attribute to trauma. Sleep deprivation can have dire consequences for everyone. Now, some departments work a 12-hour shift. It's a long time. Can that have an effect? Yeah, it can. If they're driving around all day, going to calls here and there, it can have a negative impact. Disrupting your body clock could increase your risk of mood disorders like depression. Now, it's an invisible wound, an emotional scar that can be changed. And I want you to understand that more than anything. If you're struggling from post-traumatic stress, if you've got the symptoms, they're not a permanent thing. If you get help, if you get a trauma therapist that understands your job, that is in your area, they're going to help you through this. It can be changed. The change agent should be a blend of traditional and alternative treatments like rapid resolution, EMDR, maybe a service dog. We have access to service dogs for those who are prescribed them. Equine therapy. How many here know who Jennifer O'Neill is? Wow, I am old. Thank you in the back. Jennifer O'Neill was an actress. Okay, guys, you don't have to raise your hands on this. Did you ever watch the movie Summer of 42? Okay, she's the woman in Summer of 42. You know what I mean? So she lives here, and she has an equine therapy farm up on the north side off of Brick Church Pike. She loves first responders and military. So we have access to equine therapy. Let me tell you, people tell a horse stuff that they won't tell to their therapist. Below that, there are recreational therapy things like hunting for heroes. We have access to 5-day retreats to help with that. The emphasis is that it can be changed. The first step to healing is admitting the problem. Second step is asking for help. And lastly, you can't go in and talk to a therapist and say, all right, fix me. Tell me what I got to do. Because that doesn't work. It's an exchange of information. It's participatory. You've got to interact. You've got to tell them what's going on and not make it a guessing game. It's not charades. If somebody needs help, it begins, we're one of the solutions. Call that number and we'll get you the help that you need. We've got information out on the table out front. You're free to grab whatever you want. Addiction may be co-occurring with post-traumatic stress. It's not a symptom. But addiction isn't just substances. It can include food, overeating, workaholic, porn, gambling, extreme exercising, affairs. It can be anything that you do more than you normally would to take your mind off of what you've been thinking about. Why not ask for help? Staying quiet doesn't mean you got nothing to say. It means you don't think they're ready to hear your thoughts. That's pretty significant. Dear mind, please stop thinking so much at night. I need to sleep. And I love the little frog. Sometimes all you can do is just hang on. We've all felt that way. Now, one of the reasons that we don't say anything is because of shame. We're all trained by shame. When you go to the academies, if you mess up, you get called out and you get ashamed. It's kind of like when I went through basic training and I made a mistake or one of the other guys made a mistake. The drill sergeant did not come over to me and put his arm on my shoulder and say, son, you're a nice guy. I think there's a better way to do this. Let me help you understand it better. No. He got his face in my face. His nose was touching my nose. And he is yelling at me so loud, I can't hear or think. But I know one thing. I don't want it to happen again. So when they shame you like that, and that's how you get trained in law enforcement and firefighting. If you do that, you're going to kill your partner. Well, all of a sudden you're called out. And you're looking around thinking, who saw that? Well, the same happens with trauma because people don't want to be perceived as weak. So they're afraid to ask for help. That's why we are a resource because they don't have to go through EAP to come to us. We're a secondary source. We're a safety net. So at least they've got somebody they can call. They're determined to keep their mask in place because of peer pressure, and that's what we do. We wear masks. You see, that's how training is done. I've seen those faces, and anybody here that's been in the military has seen those faces. Fear, maybe for job security. Jason Zangara, Kurt Lawless, Byron Shelton, Donnie Hecox, every one of those asked for help and lost their job. Now, Byron Shelton's not far from here. Byron got a call. He was a sheriff, 30 miles out into the country. Closest backup was a half hour away. He pulled in, heard screaming. He heard the woman yelling, "Don't kill me." So he goes into the house. There's her husband standing, looking right at him with his gun, and he shot Byron twice, once here and once here. Byron returned fire and killed that man, saved the woman's life. The governor gave him a medal for saving that woman's life. He was on injured duty leave, and so for 18 months he was trying to recover. Well, he kept asking for a light duty position. They kept saying, "We don't have anything light duty." You see, you have a right to ask for that. And he kept asking for it. They said no. Well, all of a sudden in the mail, Byron got a letter. It says, "Dear Byron, we regret to inform you that because of injuries sustained in the line of duty, we're having to terminate you." And he called me. He said, "Can they do that?" I said, "Send me a copy of the letter." I looked at it and I thought, I mean, really, who would have done this? You know, not just for the public perception, but for the legalities of it. Somehow Byron got that letter to Channel 5. Channel 5 went down and talked with his sheriff about Byron, and then he dropped the bomb. Well, what about this letter? The sheriff's eyes got as big as biscuits. And he said, I didn't sign. How did that get? That was not supposed to happen. Of course he's on the job. They rehired him. But you see, the point being, that's what happens. One reason people are afraid to call EAP, Donnie Hecox had been in a fight. Both of his shoulders were dislocated. They put him on oxy. He healed. He was off of oxy. He got into another fight, re-injured an arm. They wanted to put him back on oxy. He went to EAP, said, "Here's what's going on. I need a therapist to make sure that I don't become addicted." He left. EAP called the chief. The chief tried to fire Donnie because of an addiction. He didn't have an addiction. But that's the way they responded. That's why sometimes people are afraid. We got a call. My partner that runs Safe Call now, they're the ones that take care of all of the addictions, get people into treatment facilities. They do a great job. They got Donnie on emergency medical leave, sent him away for 30 days. He came back and they couldn't fire him because the lawyer that they hired to try and fire him sided with Donnie and said, no, he needs to stay on the job. After a few months, they got a new chief. The new chief said, nah, see you later. But you see, that's why people are afraid to ask for help. It's shame. It's fear. You know, what if you tell one of your buddies and he's up against you for a promotion? People think, well, you know, he might say something. I don't want to say anything. They're afraid they'll get a bad duty assignment. Shame is the most powerful master emotion. It's the fear that we're not good enough. If we can share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. Shame wears you down. The guilt. And that's the other side of it. Guilt is just as powerful. But its influence is positive while shame's isn't. Shame erodes our courage and fuels discouragement. I'm just going to say it. I'm pro-guilt. Guilt is good. It helps us stay on track because it's about our behavior. It occurs when we compare something we've done or failed to do with our personal values. Guilt is a real thing. If you make a mistake, you feel bad about it, you know what happened, you change it, and you go on with life. Shame, you don't want anybody to know. You want to cover it up. You don't want anybody to mention this. No need to hide behind a mask of shame. This is why we exist. When people call us, we listen. We understand what they're saying. Everybody involved with us is either active or retired first responder. Guilt, you have feelings of inadequacy. You question your capability. You have feelings of letting the team down, embarrassment in front of a spouse or partner. Masks. Mask hides shame. I love this one here, if I could read it. He's making fun of the guy of how strong he is and how he handles stress so well. But the guy's a ticking time bomb. This is what we do. We don't want people, when they look at us, they don't want people to see what we really think, how we really feel. We do this with our families. We don't want to let them down, so we act a certain way as to what we think they want to see out of us. Certainly wouldn't break down and cry in front of our family. It was funny, I went to a retreat, and as part of it, they had a therapist there. So I went in and met with him for the week, and my first visit with him, we started talking, and at the end of the session, he said, "Gosh, you've been through a lot." "Well, yes, sir." "And you didn't cry one bit." "No, sir." "Well, why not?" I said, "You're not going to see me cry. I can't anymore. It's gone." I mean, I can be watching a Hallmark movie where a little kid dies, and my wife's sitting over there bawling her eyes out. And I'm sitting there going, ain't going to happen. Ain't going to happen. Not intentionally, but if a tear comes, I quickly knock that thing away. It's just what happened to me. Now, emotionally, I feel fine. But when it comes to a tear, you couldn't collect a bottle of tears from me. It would be awful dry. But that's the way we often become. We don't want people to see our emotions. So what I'm saying is it's good to let people, someone, know how you feel. That's why we refer to trauma therapists. They're not going to judge you. They're not going to make you feel bad. They're not going to make you feel guilty. Even if you cry, they're going to help you. They're going to understand. And they'll hand you tissue. It's a good thing to do. Body, mind, and soul. That's what we address. It's the whole person. With trauma, it's below the surface. You see, it's like a mask. What you see walking around every day in each of our lives. You know, we don't look like we're falling apart inside. How many times have you heard of somebody committing suicide and you hear them say, "I never would have known that. I didn't know they were going through that." It's because they protect their emotions and hold their feelings so closely. Police are like that. Physical wounds and emotional wounds. Left untreated, both can be deadly. Physical wounds are easily and immediately identifiable. Emotional wounds, not necessarily. And they can be caused by a personal connection to a critical incident. So, for your body, you've got to have proper nutrition and exercise. Your mind, well, Beatles said it best. Get by with a little help from your friends. You know, find somebody that you trust and you can talk to. We have a corps of chaplains. We have peer advocates that we can put on the phone with somebody if they're not necessarily needing a therapist. Get appropriate therapy. Now, for me, I come from a faith background. Romans 12 says, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." That's a good statement, regardless of whether one stands in the faith spectrum or not. And you know, we all have a soul. We all have something that we believe in. And you've got to feed that. You've got to nurture that. You have rights. If you feel that you need light duty or some change, you have the right to ask. Now, if they don't have the ability to provide what you need, then there's nothing you can do. But if they just say, like Byron, forget about it. We're not going to put you inside. That happened. The man that was first in the door at the Pulse nightclub, he goes in, he rescues a guy and brings him out. The guy's name was Angel. Was telling everybody that would listen, this man's amazing. He saved my life. Could you imagine walking into a building this size with bodies laying all over the floor in different states of death? Because you don't just die immediately all the time. Gasps, body sounds, phones ringing, wanting to save them, wanting to do something. My brothers in the fire department know what that's all about. They go into a burning building and their goal is to bring out live people, not dead people. Well, the guy in Florida, they put him on light duty because every time he heard a firecracker or a car backfire, it triggered his trauma. Well, they finally came to him and said, you know what, we don't have a budget for you to stay inside. Either get back on the street or you're fired. He says, 6 months from retirement, come on. They said, nah, you're out of here. Well, a whole bunch of people contacted that mayor. Social media can be a wonderful thing. It hit social media like you wouldn't believe, and that man's phone rang off the hook. And then it was, no, we're not firing him. We're going to let him out on disability. It wasn't going to be firing. It never was. Somebody misunderstood. No, he felt the pressure. But that's what our guys face. Families of public safety. You know, children of police officers can benefit from counseling, as can the wives, because they don't understand what their husband's feeling. A therapist can help them understand what their husband's feeling and give them tools to respond to their husband or wife, you know, when those times come. The same with children. They don't get it. You know, they don't understand. Things that impact the family. Reports of police shootings. Changes of shift. There was one department that decided to go with 12-hour shifts. The guys were working 10s. Well, when they made that decision, they said, we're going to do this in 2 weeks. Well, everybody had child care to think about, part-time jobs, spouse jobs. So they got everything arranged. They did the 12-hour shifts until it was decided, that was a bad idea. We're going back to 10s. So then they had to do everything else that they just had done. That has an impact on families, on the emotions. Anti-police protest. How do you think police spouses feel when they hear, what do we want? Dead cops. How do you think they feel when it pops up on the news that a cop's being killed anywhere? Because to them, that's their husband. What do you think they feel when they hear of a firefighter that gets run over trying to put out a car fire because some moron didn't pull over? There's a reason why we have a law in Tennessee, move over, because we've had too many killed by those that didn't. That's unnecessary. Media anti-police stories. You see, often the media will run the rumor. They don't run the story. And when the investigation's done and the truth comes out, it's buried on page 18 at the bottom with the obituaries. They're not very good at saying, we were wrong. That affects the families. Political bias, protests, and financial issues. What is the impact of trauma? How does it? These are questions that we're going to talk about this afternoon. How does it affect the family? We've got a panel that will talk about that. Police officers should come with an owner's manual. I thought that was pretty clever. Firefighters too. Now, for first responders, try a little tenderness. Wasn't it Percy Sledge that had that song? That's right. I'm the old guy. But it was a song called Try a Little Tenderness. Beautiful song. It was a great song to close a slow dance. Oh, yeah. So, show your wife you care. Take time to go out on a date. Say thank you. Acknowledge the nice things that she does. The wife needs to do the same thing. Acknowledge the good things that their husbands do, or whichever way the spouse relationship goes, because it can be a female officer. You see, wives of first responders, they're protective. Before doing harm to one of our heroes, you better take a good look at his backup. The trauma impact on faith. Moral injury is a new field of study. And one of the first interactions with that was in Iraq, when soldiers went over there and got in a gunfight. They killed members of the Taliban, but what they didn't realize while bullets were flying at them is that the Taliban was shooting over the heads of women and children. So women and children got killed. Many of those soldiers committed suicide, but it tore up their insides. Think of the soldier that saw a partner from the Middle East raping a 12-year-old boy. It happened. That soldier stopped him, and he got in trouble because that person had the moral right to do it in his culture. I'm sorry. If I see that, I'm violating somebody's cultural rights, because that is not appropriate. But he got in trouble because it was his moral code. The consequences of violating our conscience can be devastating. Responses include overwhelming depression, guilt, self-medication through alcohol or drugs. I'll tell you where it shows up. People in social media, they'll be scrolling through and they'll see somebody torturing a dog or doing something terrible to a child. What they post, oh my gosh, I wouldn't say here. But the point is, it triggered a moral response. You're not supposed to do that to animals or children, but yet people do, and it violates what we believe is right. Moral injury in faith. Jonathan Shea, who worked with the veterans, first coined the term in 1994 and defined it as the violation of what is right by someone in legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. The definition widens moral injury to those in non-combat roles such as mortuary affairs, chaplaincy, engineering, etc. Moral injury is the trauma of the moral compass. And you know what? We feel it. When you see things happen in the news and you have a guttural response, that is moral injury. There's no diagnostic threshold. Under such conditions, the desire to do the right thing can sour into hate, anger, or shame. Healthcare professionals, chaplains, can help you work through different strategies to counter the feelings of shame and guilt or feelings of pain. What can cause it? As I said, there was an officer that shot a young man up in Cleveland. He got to the scene. The young man had a gun in his belt. And he had been called there by citizens that said, kids walking around brandishing a firearm. Officer gets there and he says, I need you to put your hands in the air and not touch the gun. The kid grabbed the gun and did that. What do you think happened? The officer shot him. You don't have a minute to go, can you bring that closer and let me examine the gun? It was a Glock replica that normally would come with an orange tip. The kid painted the tip so it wouldn't look like a replica. I've got my reasons why I think he did it, but it cost him his life. The community got mad. If somebody has a gun pointing at you, you have a millisecond to respond. Had it not been a fake gun, that officer could have been dead. Now, We all saw on the news recently, or I hope you did, another officer in Cleveland. Kids running around with a rifle. And citizens call kids with a gun. And he got there and he looked and he recognized it as a BB gun. And he talked to the kids. It was on body cam. He said, "What do you think would have happened if I thought that was a real gun? I would have shot you and I would have felt terrible. Don't do that. Don't go around with something that could cause you to get shot." He taught them a family lesson, took them home to the parents, explained to them what happened. They were grateful that he didn't shoot their child, but understood what caused a potential threat. You see, those are very real situations that can cause moral injury. The Green Beret who beat up the officer for raping a boy, they finally let him stay in the Army. U.S. forces ordered to ignore rampant sexual abuse of boys. See, that's what happened in Cleveland. Okay, you see the replica, you see the real handgun. If that gun was pointed at you, would you think it was real or a toy? You can't hold it, so you don't know what the weight is. It sure looks real, and your life is in danger because you believe that that's a gun that's going to shoot you. 43 Bergen County police officers either laid off or demoted. They were notified in an email. Do you think that caused moral injury? Do you think there was outrage there? They were laid off by email. I mean, that's pretty callous. Mayor tells officers to do something illegal and unethical, so most of the department quit. That was the right response. You want me to do that? Nah, not doing it. There was another department, 9 officers, they all resigned because the city would only buy 1 bulletproof vest. Think about that. What do? Hey, Fred, you got the vest? Can you bring it over here? We're in a shootout. Are faith and public safety mutually exclusive? No. But what happens? When I went on the police department, I was going to be the best Christian cop ever. I was going to help old ladies and all of that stuff. And that happened about a minute because I was trained by guys that were on in the 50s and 60s. I was trained a little differently. And fortunately, I had a partner that came on that turned my life around. It was a crossroads, and we'll talk more about that later. But you have peer pressure. It's easy to drift from faith on the job. You know, if you're working nights, when are you going to go to church? Can't get there all the time. Proactive pursuit. You've got to try and do something. Back in the day, our chief had a Bible study. Everybody went because who held it? The chief. Everybody wanted to be there. But it was a good thing, had a positive impact on me. Some good churches have Saturday night services. Now, do you recognize the guy on the right in the bottom picture? Yes, sir. That's Detective Rob. Back in the day when we could have hair. There we are at the Bible study. Suicide, and we're going to wrap up with this. Suicide is a clear and present danger. More police officers commit suicide than die in the line of duty. We have a moral imperative to do something about that. We've got to get them help. That's why we exist as Serve and Protect. That's why we're doing this video. I'm not as okay as I pretend to be. Florida deputy and wife found dead in an apparent murder-suicide. More police died in suicides than in the line of duty. I was called to a suicide of a deputy south of here to do a debriefing. So after I debriefed the officers, which, by the way, most sat there like this. Nobody wanted to talk. They said, "Can you talk to his wife?" I said, "Sure." So they opened the door, and in walks Jenny. And she didn't care about me using her name because she's put this all over social media. At the time, Jenny had a pink mohawk. She was wearing tight jeans, combat boots, and a leather jacket, and she sat down across from me and she said, "Yeah." Now, I'm supposed to debrief that, but I started talking with her. And she had never really experienced anybody in our world that really cared. So we talked and she opened up. Jenny struggled with her husband's suicide because she was in the bathroom when he shot himself in the shower. His kids were at home. And here's what I would say. Anybody considering that? Look at your wife, look at your kids, look at your family, because it'll destroy their lives. It absolutely will destroy their lives. It hurts. The surviving families of suicide have real pain, real loss, real survivor's guilt. And Jenny's children have been involved in various mental health issues. Jenny finally has moved to Florida, but is still struggling. We talk pretty regularly. She considered killing herself. And my word to her was, look at your kids. Who's going to take care of them? Nobody. So she hasn't, and she's not going to. Suicide is when a person gets to that place in life where they think absolutely nobody cares. And they're very good at hiding it. You can't always figure out when somebody is going to commit suicide. You can't tell. That's why it's often a surprise. They're hanging on at the end of hope. Chicago officer kills himself in the police station parking lot. There were 3 suicides in Chicago recently in quick order. 3 in one city. Sheriff denies honors for deputy's funeral because he committed suicide. Now, police honors are a tightly held thing. But there's more and more belief that if a police officer's suicide can be tied to a critical incident, and the same would apply to firefighters, if it can be tied to emotional struggle from a critical incident, more and more they're thinking there should be some honor for them. Because let me ask you this. If you hear of an officer committing suicide, or you knew one, or a firefighter, what was he the day before he did it? Be a hero. You never would have spoken bad about him. A minute before he did, you'd invite him out for coffee. You'd want to hang with him. But the minute it happens, for some reason, our mind goes to, hey, he's weak. He took the coward's way out. What is the most notable suicide you can think of right now of a police officer? Fox Lake, Illinois. Fox Lake, Illinois, deputy's out there, and he calls in pursuit of 3 suspects. If you're in pursuit of 3 suspects, what's the first thing you do? You give a description. You tell them where you are. Told him where he was, no description. Everybody arrives, they find him laying face down, and he was shot. All kinds of resources were committed. Air, water, dogs. I mean, all kinds of people searching for those 3 people. After a few days, it started slipping out because the chief had been saying how honorable and loving this man was. He was a hero, except that he stole money from the Explorers Lodge that he ran. And there were implications that he was involved in inappropriate touching. The guy killed himself because he couldn't stand what was getting ready to come. They were getting ready to indict him. So the point being, a suicide like that is because of wrongdoing. But there was an officer up in Canada, a Mountie, was called to a Greyhound bus. You may remember this. A man on the bus had gone insane. Well, he couldn't imagine what he was going to see. He gets on the bus, and the man is eating the man next to him. That's right. Well, do you think that tripped out the police officer? Absolutely. Well, he took the guy down. He went through emotional treatment, became an advocate for getting help with trauma. Then he killed himself. Couldn't get that out of his head. What was that man before he committed suicide? He was a hero. He was a hero. And those who have a critical incident that they're being treated for, that you can directly tie that, there needs to be some consideration for those men and women when they're struggling. We've said this before. Every 17 hours, firefighter suicide is skyrocketing. And I'm going to tell you this. Jeff Dill with the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance has done a great service for firefighters because he's got more stats on suicide than we do in law enforcement. He can tell whether they're active or retired. Red is active. Ages, and it's 30 to 45. Suicide by the years. And, that was early on in the year, the green one, that's about 2 years old. Suicide by methods, gunfire. Police officer kills himself outside the department facility. Police captain among 2 bodies found in a murder-suicide. We've had suicides here, in this area. When somebody kills himself in the parking lot of the department, and that one was on the anniversary of his service, they're making a loud statement. Marion County, found dead. Danbury, found dead. Police officer suicide in a house full of cops. Chicago has a cop suicide problem and no solution yet. Chicago, 13,500 police officers. You'd think that they'd have an EAP program that's stout. I mean, for 13,500 police officers, 1,000 EAP, 500? No. I'm not going to tell you how many, but you would be shocked. Letter from a struggling retired cop. We have to do better at taking care of our retired folks. When they leave, who are they? They're not a firefighter. They're not a cop anymore. Now, I belong to the FOP. Our lodge, we're a bunch of old farts. I mean, we're guys that have been out for a while, and we take care of each other. But for the most part, if they don't have a social group like that to hold on to, who are they? They lose their identity because when you're a cop, when you're a firefighter, that becomes who you are. That's your identity. That's how people look at you. That's what they want to talk to you about. When you're retired, you got no stories, except war stories. Now, here's the lie. My family will be better off without me. The insurance will give financial relief. Not necessarily. Nobody cares. No way out of my circumstances. It's too terrible. There is no hope. No one can help me. I'd be better off dead. Now, here's some things to look out for. They talk about suicide. Not everybody does. They're seeking out lethal means. You know, if you were going to kill yourself, would you use a gun or would you take poison? Now, you better start asking questions. Preoccupation with death. No hope for the future. Self-loathing and self-hatred. They hate themselves, can't stand themselves. Not everybody, but some. They start getting their affairs in order. They start saying goodbye. If you haven't talked to somebody in a while and they call you and say, you know, I just needed to call and say hello. I did something to you a while back and I never got to say I'm sorry. And I just wanted to say that. You better perk up your ears. Now, I have a habit because I've talked to people just before they die. I was in the music business and I saw a guy up at Brugger's and he said, man, we need to get together. I said, yeah, let's do that. He died a week later. Not suicide, but he died. So if somebody comes to mind, I'll call them and see how they're doing. But people who are thinking about suicide, they want to make things right. They want to make sure you know that they really liked you and they appreciate you. And you know, sometimes that's a sign that they're trying to plan an exit strategy. self-destructive behavior, some sense of calm. And this is what I was saying before. The minute before a police suicide, the person would likely be considered a hero. Fear, guilt, shame, and pride are the despots of emotional wellness and the enemy of healing. The mask we wear is deceptive. It hides true emotional pain. Suicide is the terminus of an emotional downward spiral that may well be directly tied to untreated trauma issues from the job. Anxiety and depression become hopelessness and despair. The numbers prove it. Twice as many as line-of-duty deaths. We must be our brother's keeper, ever vigilant, ever caring, emotional overwatch. So where do we turn for help? And I'm going to go through this quickly because I'm running over. Resources within the system. Peer support. Most places have peer support, and it may be a good resource. Employee assistance program. If you need help, you can call your employee assistants and they'll schedule things for you. The department chaplain. And the role there is a listening ear, a listening heart, a caring heart, and a serving heart. When you need a helping hand, you've got a friend, and that's us. Lost hope? We found it. Our core values are education, facilitation, restoration, and advocation. We find help. We help teach about what this situation is. What is trauma? The goal is to restore people, and when necessary, we will stand up and fight for our brothers and sisters. We will contact congressmen. We will contact mayors in Florida. We will contact a sheriff who wrongly fired an officer. We don't mind. What are they going to do, take away my birthday? Core resources. Trauma services, we facilitate the therapist with peer advocates, chaplains, and spouse support. Trauma seminars like we're doing right now. And this is free. Anybody can use it. You can watch it online. You can share it for in-service. Anything. We charge nothing for finding therapists. We take nothing for referring therapists. We take nothing for anything we do. Core values. In education, you see what we're doing. Facilitation. We really go to the nth degree to find the right therapist. I only had one, but one told me, "Nah, I don't work with cops, don't want to." I said, "Thank you for being honest." Marked her off the list. And until we find somebody that says, "Yeah, I work with police and fire," good. Because if they don't understand the job, if they don't understand their peculiarities, and we are a peculiar people, if they don't get that, they're going to think that something different may be wrong by the way we respond, with a lack of emotion perhaps. Restoration is the goal. We will stand up. Our unique 360 focus is very simple. When Safe Call Now puts somebody in treatment, we get them to offer that person a chaplain for their family while they're in treatment. And on the back end, when they're coming out, we'll have a therapist waiting for them when they arrive home. That way they don't have to wait. It's a continuum of care. We're a safety net of hope and healing. That's Ron Jones is our trainer for our chaplains, for our trauma, our peer advocates. He trains all of them and dispatches them. Carrie Steiner is our clinical advisor. Nick Doherty will be here shortly to do the financial side. Now that's our backup right there. That's for our canines that are struggling. That's right. We take care of the whole thing. That's our contact. Now remember, make up your mind. No matter what comes your way, no matter how difficult, no matter how unfair, you will do more than simply survive. You can thrive in spite of it all. Don't forget our app. And there's a crisis line. Thank you very much, and I appreciate you being here.